The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of Courtroom 7 as Harold Morrison slowly made his way to the defendant's table. At 84 years old, every step seemed to carry the weight of decades. His gray hair was neatly combed, and despite the circumstances, he wore his best suit, the same navy blue one he'd worn to his wife's funeral 3 years earlier. But what drew everyone's attention wasn't the suit. It was the Bronze Star medal pinned carefully to his left lapel, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Hank, as everyone in Millbrook had called him for the past 40 years, had never imagined he'd find himself in this position. The small town where he'd lived since 1975 had always treated him as their local hero. Every Veterans Day, he was asked to speak at the high school. Every 4th of July, he rode in the parade, waving from the back of a red convertible while children ran alongside. Their faces filled with admiration. The courtroom filled slowly. Mrs. Patterson from the grocery store slid into the third row, shaking her head in disbelief. Behind her sat Tom Rodriguez, who ran the hardware store where Hank bought his gardening supplies every spring. These weren't just spectators, they were neighbors, friends, people who had known Hank for decades. They came not out of curiosity, but out of loyalty to a man they couldn't imagine being dishonest about anything, let alone his military service. Judge Patricia Kellerman entered precisely at 9 o'clock, her black robes flowing behind her like storm clouds. She was known throughout the county as a no-nonsense judge who didn't let emotion cloud her judgment. At 58, she'd seen enough cases to spot a fraud from across the room. Her reputation for being tough but fair had earned her respect from both prosecutors and defense attorneys. As everyone rose for the judge's entrance, Hank's hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, exactly, but from the surreal nature of it all. 6 months ago, he'd been just another retiree tending his vegetable garden and playing chess at the community center. Now he sat accused of one of the most shameful acts a person could commit, lying about military service for personal gain. The trouble had started with a newspaper article. The local paper had wanted to do a feature story about Vietnam veterans in the area for Memorial Day. They'd interviewed Hank, as they had many times before, and he'd shared some of his memories. But this time, a new reporter had decided to dig deeper. When she couldn't find Harold Morrison's name in the standard military databases, she'd contacted the Veterans Administration. That phone call had set off a chain of events that led to this moment. District Attorney William Chun stood to address the court. He was a man in his early 40s who had built his career on being thorough and methodical. Chun didn't take on cases he couldn't win, and his presence here today suggested he was confident in his evidence. Your Honor, Chun began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, what we have here is a case of stolen valor that has gone on for far too long. The defendant, Harold Morrison, has for over 4 decades presented himself as a decorated Vietnam War veteran. He has accepted honors, given speeches, and received benefits based on service that never happened. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Mrs. Patterson clutched her purse tighter. Tom Rodriguez leaned forward, straining to hear every word. Chun continued, our investigation has revealed that there is no record of Harold Morrison serving in any capacity in Vietnam. No deployment records, no unit assignments, no evidence whatsoever that he was ever in Southeast Asia during the conflict. Yet he wears the Bronze Star medal with pride, knowing full well he has no right to it. Hank felt his chest tighten. The words hit him like physical blows. He wanted to stand up, to shout the truth, but his lawyer had warned him to stay quiet during the opening statements. The prosecutor walked over to his table and picked up a thick folder. We have documentation from the Department of Defense showing no record of Harold Morrison's alleged service. We have testimony from Veterans Administration officials who confirmed that his name appears in no military personnel files from the Vietnam era. We even have statements from other veterans who served during that time who never encountered the defendant. Chun paused, letting his words sink in. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the old building settling. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he said, turning to face the 12 citizens who would decide Hank's fate. Stolen valor is not a victimless crime. When someone falsely claims military honors, they diminish the real sacrifices made by genuine heroes. They steal recognition that belongs to men and women who actually bled for their country. In the gallery, Hank's daughter Linda wiped tears from her eyes. She was 45 years old and had grown up hearing her father's stories about Vietnam. She'd brought friends to his Veterans Day speeches. She'd been proud when the American Legion named him their Man of the Year in 2018. Now she sat wondering if everything she'd believed about her father was a lie. Chun walked back to his table, but wasn't finished. The evidence will show that Harold Morrison has lived a lie for over 40 years. He has accepted the gratitude of his community under false pretenses. He has worn that medal knowing he never earned it through service to his country. The prosecutors' final words hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. We ask that you find the defendant guilty of stolen valor and that this court order the immediate confiscation of all military honors he has falsely claimed. As Chun sat down, the weight of his accusations seemed to press down on everyone in the room. Hank stared straight ahead, his weathered hands folded in his lap. The bronze star on his chest felt heavier than it ever had before. In the space of 20 minutes, his reputation, his honor, and his standing in the community had been systematically torn apart. Judge Kellerman looked over her reading glasses at the defense table. Counselor, are you ready to proceed with your opening statement? Defense attorney Robert Walsh stood slowly. He was a public defender in his 50s who had taken Hank's case pro bono after hearing about it through a local veterans group. Walsh had served in the Army himself, though not in Vietnam, and something about Hank's story didn't sit right with him. But as he looked at the stack of evidence on the prosecutor's table, and then at his own meager file, Walsh couldn't help but wonder if he was about to defend a man who had spent 4 decades living a lie. The empty seats behind Chun's table seemed to mock him. Where were Hank's fellow veterans if his service was real? Where were the Army buddies who could vouch for him? All Walsh had was an old man's word against official government records. And in a courtroom, that usually wasn't enough. Robert Walsh cleared his throat and stood up slowly. The weight of defending a man against such serious accusations pressed down on his shoulders like a heavy backpack. He looked at the jury, then at Hank, who sat with his eyes closed as if he was somewhere far away from this courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, Walsh began, his voice steady but softer than the prosecutor's had been. Sometimes the truth is more complicated than it appears on paper. Sometimes the very government that sends young men to war also asks them to disappear from history. A murmur went through the courtroom. Judge Kellerman raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Walsh walked closer to the jury box. Harold Morrison did serve his country in Vietnam, but his service was so secret, so classified that even today, 50 years later, most of the records remain buried in government files that may never see daylight. Hank opened his eyes and looked at his lawyer. They had talked about this moment many times, about whether to reveal what had been hidden for so long. Your Honor, Walsh continued, I'd like to call my first witness, Linda Morrison, the defendant's daughter. Linda stood up on shaky legs. She was a nurse at the county hospital, a woman who had spent her life helping others heal, but today she looked like she needed healing herself. Her eyes were red from crying and her hands trembled as she walked to the witness stand after being sworn in. Linda sat down and looked at her. Father? The love in her eyes was clear, but so was the confusion and pain. Linda, Walsh said gently, tell us about growing up with your father. Linda took a deep breath. Dad was different. Other fathers came home from work and played with their kids or watched TV. Dad would disappear into the basement for hours. Sometimes I'd hear him down there, talking to himself. Or crying, she paused, wiping her eyes with a tissue. When I was little, I thought all dads had nightmares. I thought it was normal for fathers to wake up screaming in the middle of the night. The courtroom was completely silent. Even the court reporter seemed to type more quietly. Did your father ever talk about Vietnam? Walsh asked. Never, Linda said quickly. If anyone asked him about the war, he would get this look in his eyes like he was seeing something terrible. Then he'd change the subject or leave the room. Walsh nodded. What about the medal? When did you first see him wear it? Linda thought for a moment. I was maybe 12 or 13. This older man came to our house one evening. He was in an army uniform and he looked very official. Dad talked to him on the front porch for a long time. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I saw Dad crying. She stopped and looked at her father again. The next day, Dad had that bronze star, but he didn't celebrate or anything. He just put it in a drawer and wouldn't talk about it. And when did he start wearing it publicly? Years later. The town started having Veterans Day ceremonies, and people kept asking Dad to participate. At first, he always said no, but eventually he gave in. I think he felt like he owed it to the other veterans to honor their service, even if he couldn't talk about his own. Walsh thanked Linda and called his next witness. Dr. Patricia Kovac was a psychiatrist who specialized in treating veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder. She was in her 60s with gray hair and kind eyes that had seen more pain than most people could imagine. Dr. Kovac, Walsh began, you've been treating Harold Morrison for the past 15 years. Can you tell us about his condition? Dr. Kovac looked at Hank with obvious compassion. Harold suffers from severe PTSD related to combat trauma. But his case is unusual because he's never been able to talk about what happened to him. Most of my patients can eventually share their experiences, which helps with healing. Harold has only been able to give me fragments. What kind of fragments? He talks about jungles and being afraid to make noise. He mentions watching friends die but not being able to help them. He has recurring nightmares about being lost and having no way to contact anyone for help. Dr. Kovac paused and pulled out a notepad. But the most telling thing is what he says during his worst episodes. He keeps repeating, I can't tell them. I promised I wouldn't tell. It's like he's carrying some terrible secret that he's not allowed to share. The prosecutor Chun objected. This is speculation, Your Honor. I'll allow it, Judge Kellerman said. Continue, Doctor. In all my years treating veterans, I've learned to recognize different types of trauma. Harold's symptoms are consistent with someone who served in special operations or classified missions. The secrecy itself becomes part of the trauma. Walsh walked back to his table and picked up a thin folder. Dr. Kovac, in your professional opinion, is Harold Morrison lying about his military service? Absolutely not, she said firmly. This man carries the psychological wounds of someone who saw terrible combat. You can't fake the kind of trauma he lives with every day. As Dr. Kovac stepped down, Walsh called his final witness. The courtroom stirred as an elderly man in a wheelchair was brought in. He wore a Vietnam veteran cap and had the weathered look of someone who had seen too much. State your name for the record, Walsh said. Franklin Torres. I served in the 101st Airborne in Vietnam from 1967 to 1969. Do you know Harold Morrison? Torres looked at Hank and nodded slowly. I knew him as Rabbit. That was his call sign. A gasp went through the courtroom. Hank's head shot up, and for the first time all day there was recognition in his eyes. Tell us about Rabbit, Walsh said. Torres was quiet for a long moment. Some things happened over there that we were told never to talk about. Operations that didn't officially exist. Men who were never officially there. He pointed a shaky finger at Hank. Rabbit saved my life and the lives of 11 other soldiers in March of 1968. We were on a mission that I still can't fully describe, even today. When it went wrong, he stayed behind to make sure the rest of us got out. Torres's voice got stronger. They told us when we got back that the mission never happened, that we were never there. Some of us got medals later, but they were given in secret. We were ordered never to speak about what we did or who we served with. The old veteran's eyes filled with tears. I've kept that secret for over 50 years, but I can't sit here and watch them call Rabbit a liar. That man earned every bit of honor he's ever received. Walsh stood quietly for a moment, letting Torres's words sink in. Then he addressed the jury one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, Harold Morrison served his country in ways that most of us can't imagine. He did things and saw things that the government decided were too secret to ever acknowledge. For 50 years, he's carried the burden of service that he couldn't talk about, couldn't share, couldn't even prove. Walsh looked at the bronze star on Hank's chest. That medal isn't stolen valor. It's a small recognition for sacrifices that go far beyond what any piece of metal can represent. The real question isn't whether Harold Morrison deserves that medal. The question is whether our government has the right to erase a man's service, just because it's inconvenient to remember. As Walsh sat down, the courtroom was filled with a heavy silence. The prosecutor's case had seemed so clear, so straightforward, but now nothing seemed simple anymore. The courtroom felt different after Franklin Torres finished his testimony. The air seemed thicker, charged with emotion and uncertainty. Judge Kellerman sat back in her chair, her fingers drumming silently on the bench as she processed what she had just heard. The case that had seemed so straightforward an hour ago now felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. She had been a judge for over 20 years. She had seen every type of case imaginable, from petty theft to murder, from fraud to domestic violence. She prided herself on being able to see through lies and manipulation. But this case was testing everything she thought she knew about truth. And Justice the prosecutor, Chun, looked uncomfortable for the first time all day. His carefully prepared case was built on official records and documented evidence. But Franklin Torres's testimony had introduced something he hadn't planned, for the possibility that official records might not tell the whole story. Judge Kellerman called for a 30-minute recess. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Hank remained seated at the defendant's table. His lawyer, Walsh, leaned over to speak with him, but Hank seemed lost in his own thoughts. The bronze star on his chest caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, creating small reflections that danced on the wall behind him. Linda Morrison couldn't bring herself to leave her father's side. She moved from the gallery to sit beside him, taking his weathered hand in hers. "Dad," she whispered, "why didn't you ever tell me about any of this?" Hank looked at his daughter, really looked at her for the first time all day. "Because I made a promise," he said quietly. "And when you're a soldier, promises matter more than anything else." In the hallway outside the courtroom, groups of people clustered together, whispering and trying to make sense of what they had heard. Mrs. Patterson from the grocery store stood with Tom Rodriguez, both of them looking confused and worried. "I've known Harold for 20 years, Mrs. Patterson said, shaking her head. "He's never lied about anything. When my husband was dying, Harold came by every day to help with the yard work. He never asked for anything in return." Tom nodded in agreement. "Remember when the high school needed someone to talk to the kids about military service? Harold always said yes, even though you could see it was hard for him. That doesn't sound like a man who's lying about being a veteran." But not everyone in the hallway was supporting Hank. A younger man in his 30s, wearing a military jacket with Iraq war patches, spoke angrily to anyone who would listen. "I don't care what excuses he has. I lost friends in Iraq. Real heroes who earned their medals with blood. If this old man is lying, he's spitting on their graves." When court resumed, Judge Kellerman looked tired. The weight of the decision she had to make was visible on her face. She called both lawyers to the bench for a private conference that lasted several minutes. From the defendant's table, Hank could see them pointing at documents and speaking in hushed tones. Finally, she dismissed the lawyers and addressed the courtroom. "This case has presented some unusual circumstances," she began. "However, the law is clear about what constitutes proof of military service." She picked up a thick manual from her desk. "Military records are maintained by the Department of Defense for a reason. They provide official documentation of service, awards, and commendations. Without proper documentation, this court cannot verify claims of military service, regardless of personal testimony." The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Linda Morrison felt her stomach drop. In the gallery, Mrs. Patterson put her hand over her mouth in shock. Judge Kellerman continued, her voice steady but showing no emotion. "While the testimony we've heard today is compelling, it does not constitute legal proof of military service. The defendant's name appears in no official military records from the Vietnam War period. There are no deployment orders, no unit assignments, no documentation of the Bronze Star Award. She paused and looked directly at Hank. Mr. Morrison, I understand that you may believe you served honorably. However, without proper documentation, this court cannot recognize that service as legitimate. Walsh started to stand, but Judge Kellerman held up her hand. The law regarding stolen valor is specific. It is illegal to wear military decorations that were not officially awarded. Regardless of the circumstances, wearing an undocumented Bronze Star constitutes a violation of federal law. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Hank sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead. His hands, which had been trembling all day, suddenly became completely steady. Therefore, Judge Kellerman said, her voice carrying clearly through the room, I find the defendant guilty of wearing unauthorized military decorations. Linda Morrison let out a sob that echoed off the courtroom walls. In the gallery, several people gasped or shook their heads in disbelief, but Judge Kellerman wasn't finished. She looked at Hank again, and for just a moment her professional mask seemed to slip. Mr. Morrison, I am ordering you to remove that Bronze Star immediately and surrender it to this court. The words hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Hank slowly raised his hands to his chest, his fingers finding the familiar weight of the medal he had worn with such pride and pain for so many years. Your Honor, Walsh said, standing quickly, I request time to file an appeal. Motion denied. Judge Kellerman replied firmly. The defendant will comply with this order immediately. Hank's fingers worked at the pin holding the Bronze Star to his jacket. His hands, which had been steady moments before, now shook so badly he could barely manage the simple task. The entire courtroom watched in stunned silence as this 84-year-old man struggled to remove the only physical recognition he had ever received for what he insisted was his service to his country. Linda reached over to help him, but Hank gently pushed her hands away. I can do it, he whispered. I have to do it myself. The pin finally came free, and Hank held the Bronze Star in his palm. The metal felt warm from being against his chest, and the ribbon was slightly faded from years of wear. He stared at it. For a long moment, as if memorizing every detail, Franklin Torres, still sitting in his wheelchair in the witness area, had tears streaming down his face. This is wrong, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. This is just wrong, Judge Kellerman banged her gavel. Order in the court. Slowly, painfully, Hank stood up and walked toward the judge's bench. Each step seemed to take enormous effort, as if he were walking through deep mud. When he reached the bench, he held out his hand with the Bronze Star resting in his palm. Judge Kellerman looked down at the medal, then at the broken old man offering it to her. For just a moment, her composure cracked, and those watching could see something that might have been regret flash across her face. She took the medal without a word and placed it in a clear evidence bag. The small piece of metal and ribbon looked even smaller and more insignificant sealed away in plastic. This court is adjourned, Judge Kellerman said, her voice barely above a whisper. As the gavel fell for the final time, Hank stood at the bench. For several more seconds, staring at the evidence bag containing his medal. Then, without looking back at his daughter or the people who had come to support him, he walked slowly toward the courtroom exit. The Bronze Star was gone, but the weight of its absence felt heavier than the medal had ever been. The gavel's echo was still ringing in everyone's ears when Hank turned away from the judge's bench. His shoulders sagged like a man carrying an invisible weight that had suddenly become unbearable. The Bronze Star was gone, sealed away in that cold plastic evidence bag, and with it seemed to go the last piece of recognition for a life of service that apparently never existed in the eyes of the law. Linda Morrison rushed toward her father, her heels clicking on the polished courthouse floor. She reached for his arm, but Hank moved like a man in a trance, barely acknowledging her presence. His eyes stared straight ahead, seeing something that no one else in the room could see. Judge Kellerman gathered her papers with quick, efficient movements. The case was closed as far as she was concerned. The law had been followed, the evidence had been weighed, and justice had been served according to the books. But something about the whole situation left a bitter taste in her mouth that she couldn't quite shake. "All rise," the bailiff called out. Preparing for the judge's exit, the courtroom slowly came to life as people began standing and gathering their belongings. Conversations started in hushed whispers, but the mood was heavy and somber. This wasn't how anyone had expected the day to end. Mrs. Patterson wiped tears from her eyes as she struggled to stand. Her arthritis made quick movements difficult, but her heart was hurting more than her joints. "I just can't believe it," she whispered to Tom Rodriguez. "Harold Morrison, a liar? It doesn't make sense." Tom shook his head sadly. "I've seen that. Man break down crying at every Veterans Day ceremony for the past 10 years. You can't fake that kind of pain." Behind them, the Iraq War veteran who had spoken angrily in the hallway now looked uncertain. Watching an elderly man forced to surrender his medal had been harder to witness than he'd expected. The satisfaction he thought he'd feel wasn't there. Instead, he felt empty and confused. Franklin Torres sat in his wheelchair, staring at the spot where Hank had stood moments before. His weathered hands gripped the armrest so tightly his knuckles had turned white. 50 years of keeping secrets, 50 years of following orders to stay quiet, and this was how it ended. His friend, Rabbit, humiliated and stripped of his honor in front of the whole town. Judge Kellerman was about to step down from the bench when she noticed that the courtroom doors at the back of the room were slowly opening. She paused, her hand on her gavel, expecting to see a late arrival or perhaps someone who had stepped out during the recess, but what she saw made her freeze completely. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, backlit by the bright hallway lights. Behind him, the person was tall and straight, with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command. Even from a distance, it was clear this wasn't just another curious observer or late-arriving family member. The conversations throughout the courtroom began to fade as one by one people noticed the new arrival. There was something about the way he stood that commanded attention without him saying a single word. He seemed to be taking in the entire scene, studying the room and everyone in it with eyes that had seen a lifetime of serious situations. Linda looked up from comforting her father and gasped softly. Hank, lost in his own world of pain and confusion, hadn't noticed anything yet. The figure stepped fully into the courtroom, and now everyone could see him clearly. He was an elderly man, probably in his late 80s, but he moved with the controlled precision of someone much younger. His gray hair was perfectly styled, and his posture was ramrod straight, despite his age. But what really caught everyone's attention was his uniform. He wore a dress blue army uniform that looked like it had been pressed just that morning. The fabric was crisp and spotless, and every button gleamed under the courtroom lights. Across his chest was an impressive display of ribbons and medals that spoke of a long and distinguished military career. Combat Infantry Badge, Purple Heart, Silver Star, and others that most people in the room couldn't identify but knew were significant. The mysterious visitor began walking down the center aisle of the courtroom with measured, deliberate steps. His polished black shoes made soft sounds on the floor that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. He didn't hurry, didn't look left or right, but kept his eyes fixed straight ahead. Judge Kellerman found herself unable to move. In all her years on the bench, she had never had someone enter her courtroom with such commanding presence during an official proceeding. She should have said something, should have asked who he was and what he wanted, but something about his bearing stopped the words in her throat. The prosecutor, Chun, looked up from packing his briefcase and did a double take. He had been feeling good about his victory, satisfied that justice had been served and another case of stolen valor had been stopped. But the sight of this distinguished military figure walking toward them made his confidence waver. Walsh, the defense attorney, stood up slowly from his chair. He had been preparing to console his client and discuss appeal options, but now he found himself mesmerized by the approaching figure. There was something familiar about the man, though he couldn't place what it was. As the stranger continued his slow march down the aisle, more details became visible. His face was deeply lined but strong, with eyes that seemed to have witnessed both terrible tragedy and great triumph. There were scars on his hands that spoke of combat experience, and the way he carried himself suggested someone who had led others through difficult situations. Mrs. Patterson grabbed Tom's arm. "Who is that?" she whispered. Tom could only shake his head. He had lived in this town for 30 years and knew most people by sight. But this man was a complete stranger. The mysterious visitor was now halfway down the aisle, and still he hadn't spoken a word or acknowledged anyone except through his steady forward movement. His silence was somehow more powerful than any speech could have been. Franklin Torres suddenly gripped the wheels of his wheelchair and spun around to get a better look. His eyes widened as recognition began to dawn on his face. "It can't be," he whispered to himself. "After all these years?" Hank, still lost in his grief and humiliation, finally became aware that something unusual was happening. The quality of silence in the room had changed from the heavy quiet of sadness to the electric stillness of anticipation. He slowly raised his head and turned to see what everyone else was staring at. When his eyes found the approaching figure, Hank's entire body went rigid. The color drained from his face, and for a moment it looked like he might collapse. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The man in uniform was now just 20 feet away from the defendant's table. Still, he hadn't spoken, hadn't acknowledged anyone, hadn't explained his presence. But his very being seemed to fill the courtroom with an energy that made everyone hold their breath. Judge Kellerman finally found her voice. "Sir," she called out, though not as firmly as she had intended. "Sir, this court session has been concluded. If you have business here, you'll need to—" But her words trailed off as the man turned his gaze toward her. His eyes held a mixture of authority and sadness that made her feel like a young law student again rather than an experienced judge. The stranger continued his approach to the front of the courtroom, each step bringing him closer to Hank, who sat transfixed as if seeing a ghost from his past walk back into his life. The mysterious figure reached the front of the courtroom and stopped directly in front of Hank's table. For a long moment, the two elderly men simply stared at each other across the decades. Hank's hands trembled as memories he had buried for 50 years came flooding back like a dam breaking. "Rabbit," the stranger said quietly, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command that had once led men through impossible situations. "It's been a long time." The single word hit Hank like lightning. Only one person had ever called him by that nickname, and that man was supposed to be dead. Killed in action, according to the official reports that never officially existed. "Colonel Brennan?" Hank whispered, his voice barely audible. "Dutch? But how? They told us you were dead?" Colonel Brennan smiled sadly. "That's what they told everyone. Sometimes it's easier for the government to bury the living along with the missions that never happened." The courtroom erupted in confused murmurs. Judge Kellerman banged her gavel, but even she seemed too stunned to restore complete order. Franklin Torres was crying openly now, recognizing the man he thought he'd lost forever in the jungles of Vietnam. Colonel James Brennan was 89 years old, but his voice still carried the authority that had once commanded respect from hardened soldiers half his age. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather briefcase that looked like it had seen decades of careful handling. "Your Honor," he said, turning to address Judge Kellerman directly, "I apologize for interrupting your court proceedings. My name is Colonel James Brennan, United States Army, retired. I've traveled here from Montana because I couldn't allow this travesty to continue." Judge Kellerman found her voice, though it came out smaller than usual. "Colonel, this case has been decided. The defendant was found guilty based on the available evidence." "The available evidence was incomplete," Brennan replied firmly, "and I'm here to provide what was missing." He opened the briefcase with steady hands and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. "For the past 6 months, I've been working with congressional investigators and military archives to have certain classified documents released. Documents that prove Harold Morrison's service and sacrifice." Shun, the prosecutor, stood up quickly. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." The defense had ample opportunity to present evidence during the trial. Colonel Brennan turned his steel-gray eyes toward the prosecutor. "Son, this evidence has been classified at the highest levels for over 50 years. It was only declassified 3 days ago, specifically because of this case. He walked over to Judge Kellerman's bench and placed the folder in front of her. Your Honor, in March of 1968, Sergeant Harold Morrison led a classified reconnaissance mission behind enemy lines in Vietnam. When that mission went wrong, he saved the lives of 12 American soldiers. The colonel's voice grew stronger as he continued. He stayed behind under heavy enemy fire to ensure his men could escape. He was wounded twice but refused evacuation until every other soldier was safe. For his actions, he was awarded the Bronze Star in a classified ceremony. Judge Kellerman opened the folder with trembling hands. The first document was an official commendation letter bearing the seal of the United States Army and signed by a general whose name she recognized from history books. The mission was so sensitive that all participants were sworn to secrecy, Colonel Brennan continued. Their names were removed from standard military databases. Their service records were classified and stored separately. For 50 years, these men have lived with the burden of service they couldn't prove and sacrifices they couldn't share. Hank was sobbing now, great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. Linda rushed to his side, wrapping her arms around her. Father, as he finally allowed himself to feel the pain he had carried alone for decades. Franklin Torres wheeled his chair closer. Colonel, is it really you? We thought. After the ambush, we thought. Double quote. I survived, Frank, Brennan said gently. Barely. Spent 8 months in a Vietnamese prison camp before I was rescued. But like all of you, I was ordered to disappear. From the official records. He turned back to Judge Kellerman, who was reading through document after document with growing amazement. Your Honor, these files contain not only proof of Harold Morrison's service, but detailed accounts of his heroism. He didn't just earn the Bronze Star, he earned the respect and gratitude of every man who served under my command. The courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of pages turning as Judge Kellerman reviewed the evidence. Army reports, witness statements, medical records showing Hank's combat wounds, and photographs of a much younger Harold Morrison in military uniform in what was clearly a jungle setting. There's more, Colonel Brennan said, reaching into his briefcase again. I've brought some friends who can verify Harold's service. The courtroom doors opened again, and 3 more elderly men in military dress uniforms entered. They moved slowly. Some with canes, but their bearing was unmistakably that of veterans. Each man's chest displayed the ribbons and medals of a long military career. These are some of the men Harold saved that day in 1968, Colonel Brennan announced. They've traveled from across the country to set the record straight. One of the men, using a walker to move forward, spoke in a voice roughened by age, but clear with conviction. Your Honor, Harold Morrison is the reason I'm alive today. He's the reason my children have a father and my grandchildren have a grandfather. If that's not worthy of a Bronze Star, then no medal ever given has any meaning. Judge Kellerman set down the papers and looked at the evidence bag containing Hank's confiscated medal. A small piece of bronze and ribbon suddenly seemed to carry the weight of history and sacrifice that she had failed to recognize before. Mr. Morrison, she said, her voice thick with emotion, please approach the bench. Hank stood on unsteady legs, supported by his daughter and Franklin Torres. When he reached the bench, Judge Kellerman looked down at him with tears in her eyes. Harold Morrison, she said formally, based on the new evidence presented to this court, I hereby overturn my previous ruling. You are found not guilty of all charges. She picked up the evidence bag and carefully removed the Bronze Star with her own hands. She pinned it back to Hank's jacket, right over his heart where it belonged. Furthermore, she continued, I offer my sincere apology to you and to all the veterans who served in classified operations. Your sacrifice and service honor this court and this country. The courtroom exploded in applause. Mrs. Patterson was crying and clapping at the same time. Tom Rodriguez whistled loudly. Even some of the court staff joined in the ovation. Colonel Brennan saluted Harold Morrison, and one by one the other veterans followed suit. 50 years of silence, 50 years of carrying secrets and bearing invisible wounds, finally ended with the recognition and honor that had always been rightfully theirs. Hank touched the Bronze Star on his chest. then looked at his old commanding officer through tears of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Dutch. Thank you for not forgetting us." "A good officer never abandons his men," Colonel Brennan replied. "Not even 50 years later?" As the applause continued, Judge Kellerman made a note in her file that this case would be sealed and the charges completely expunged from Harold Morrison's record. Some stories, she realized, were bigger than the law books that governed her courtroom. The Bronze Star gleamed on Hank's chest, no longer a symbol of shame and accusation, but what it had always been, a testament to courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds between soldiers who had faced the impossible together and lived to tell about it.